Stefanco. I am a former university president and now CEO of Baret Leadership Consulting. And I'm also very proud to say that I'm a senior associate for international for HELM. And I'm here to welcome two fabulous women who I know we're going to have a great conversation. First, my colleague at HELM, Denise Zinn, and she will tell you a little bit about herself in a moment. And my colleague in the US, Maria Gallo, who will tell you also about herself. Now, there's more information available in the bios, so please read about these two women. But as you know, we are here to talk about initiatives to advance women in higher education, both in the United States and in South Africa. And I would like to begin by asking Denise and Maria to tell us a little bit about themselves and the programs that they lead, and the types of challenges that women in higher education are facing in both South Africa and in the United States. Denise, would you please start?
Okay, thank you very much, Carolyn, and greetings to all those in the audience, and greetings to Maria, also out in the cold Mid-East, I think she said it was, in the United States at 6 a.m. in the morning. So a warm welcome to you all and to the audience. So my name is Denise Zinn. I was up until 2019 the Deputy Vice Chancellor for Learning and Teaching at Nelson Mandela University. And prior to that, I was the Executive Dean of the Faculty of Education there, and prior to that, Executive Dean of the Faculty of Education at the University of Fort Hare. So those are sort of the main leadership positions I've held in higher education. But I've always been involved in gender equity work in the Tertiary Education Linkages Project, which President Larry Robinson actually mentioned in his introductory comments. And there I was responsible for the gender equity milestone. And also in HERS, which is an organization which is also focused on women in higher education leadership. So currently I run the Women in Leadership program for HELM and under the auspices of USAF. Thank you, Carolyn.
Oh, Carolyn, you're on mute.
So I'll leave myself off mute. Thank you, Maria. Sorry about that.
No problem. No problem. So first, I want to express my gratitude for this opportunity to speak today and join distinguished colleagues Carolyn Stefanco and Denise Zinn. So it's quite an honor. A little bit about my background. I didn't start out as an administrator. I started out as a faculty member. I'm a plant molecular biologist, and the bulk of my career was spent about 16 years at the University of Florida. And then I went into administration as chair of my department at Florida, as a dean of the College of Tropical Agriculture and Human Resources at the University of Hawaii at Manoa, and then as president of Delaware Valley University, which is in southeastern Pennsylvania, and did that for 5 years. And now currently I'm chancellor of the University of Wisconsin at River Falls. And indeed, we're 24 degrees Fahrenheit and snowing at the moment. And so it's quite chilly here, but to be expected this time of year. But as far as our conversation here today, I'm also chair of the American Council on Education's Women's Network Executive Council. It's quite a mouthful, but the WNEC has a long history. It was established in 1977 from a Carnegie Foundation grant to ACE, and then it's evolved over time. And basically what we work on is equity issues within the US relative to higher education leadership.
Thank you so much for a little bit of that background, largely focusing on your involvement, and I know for both of you it's career long. Could you tell us a little bit more about the challenges that women have faced and continue to face in the context of your own higher education systems in terms of equity and diversity issues? Denise?
Okay. Thanks for that, Carolyn. I mean, as you all know, it goes back more than decades. It goes back centuries. And as far as statistics are concerned, I just want to do a shout out to Doctors Adele Moodley and Dr. Nolutando Tony, who are colleagues of ours. They may be in the audience, who have since 2015 been doing some of the most up-to-date research that will give the statistics. But in broader strokes, currently in South African universities, women students outnumber men by a clear margin, on average around 60% to 40%, female to male students on average. And the same is true of those who graduate. But they are still disproportionately represented across faculties and discipline, with more men in the STEM-related fields, in science and engineering, agriculture, for example, and more women in the humanities-related fields such as education, the social sciences, social work, nursing, and so on. So that's our student population. In relation to academic staff, the numbers have also improved and on the surface seem to be reaching some form of an equitable distribution with, sort of like 51% female to 49% male in some cases and the other way around. But if you look deeper, women are disproportionately much more represented in the lower ranks of junior, associates, and lecturer levels than in the senior lecturer, professor, associate professor levels, as one moves up the academic ranks. And then when you look at the leadership and management levels, the proportions just switch around. At middle level, which is sort of at the level of heads of department, it again seems to be equitable, but again, disproportionate in terms of the disciplines. But once we come to dean level, you can see the inversion starting to happen. And as you move up towards Deputy Vice-Chancellor and Vice-Chancellor, in South Africa, at the top level of Vice-Chancellor, which is the same as President in the United States, we have 26 institutions. I mean, relatively small number if you compare this to your audience there in the United States, but 26 public institutions. And of those 26, up to 2022, we have had only 6 women VCs, approximately 23%. From next year, there will be another one joining. So it will be 7 out of 26, which takes the number up to about 26%. But as I compare this with international figures, it's approximately the same. It's actually quite similar. So at a recent meeting, just for a recent thing, we had a dean's workshop, and we had 41 people register for that workshop, and of those 41, 26 were male and 15 were female, which sort of represents the distribution from that level upwards, and it gets lower. So I think that just sketches a background to our context, Carolyn and Maria.
Yeah, and I have to say, much of what you said sounds pretty similar to what I know is the case in the US. I know that ACE is our professional association that does the studies every 5 years, and I know a new one is about to come out. I don't know if Maria, if you've had access to that data, or we need to use the 5-year-old data, but can you tell us either by using statistics or yes, qualitative measures what's happening in the US with regard to women's advancement?
Sure, and it does sound very familiar. So there's a recent report by the EOS Foundation, and that was a 2022 report. And statistics there say that women hold about 1 out of 5, or 22% roughly, of leadership positions. And they examined top research universities, and there was 130 of those. And women of color, only 5%. And that's despite women earning more bachelor's degrees in the US for the last 40 years, more master's degrees than men for the last 35 years, and more doctoral degrees for the last 15 years. So there is not parity quite yet. And when we look at the level of deans and provosts, women are nearly 40% of those positions. And that's from which like 75% of all presidents are drawn. So even when you do the math, as I did, it should then be closer to more 30%, right? If you're looking at that statistic right now from that level. But like I said, it's more around the 20% mark. So the main point there is there's a power gap, not a pipeline issue. So it's not that women are not in the pipeline, they're there, but they're not reaching those heights. The other interesting points are that women are more likely to be hired in the U.S. for top positions in time of crisis. And that also makes success harder for them to achieve. And when you examine to public universities versus private universities, the publics do a little bit better than the privates. So the privates are even more behind. And then when you also examine overall institutions within the US, and this comes from an ACE TIAA report, and that's 5 years ago, the majority of women presidents were serving either at associate level granting institutions or minority serving institutions. So we see a trend there where it's, associate, minority serving institutions and institutions in crisis. Right. So Forbes reported that it's really a lack of diversity in hiring processes, and not so much in individual issues, but more, they said, systemic bias. And then Stanford Graduate School of Education has reported that there is implicit bias against feminine academic work. So I think what they mean there is the obstacle to progress is something like being in student affairs or in areas that are deemed more feminine type positions in higher ed.
So what drew you to this concern? We're going to spend probably most of our time today talking about the programs that you lead, a little bit, hopefully, more about their history and the priorities and the goals that you have for today. But before we get to that, what drew you to this work? I know, as I've already mentioned, it's a career-long commitment, and you've both been role models in holding senior leadership positions, but you've also been involved in so many other ways. And what about you that led you to be concerned and that led you to lend your efforts to make higher education community aware of these problems and to try to change things for women who are coming up behind us?
Do you want me to go?
Yeah, either of you.
Okay, so I think that, the issue of gender inequity goes back centuries, not decades, goes back centuries in higher education. And it's precisely this disproportional representation, both in terms of academic staff as well as students, that norms got developed. They got developed out of this inequity. Universities were for men. The people who taught in universities were men. And so I guess it should be no surprise that the norms and what became expected, what the circumstances were on which norms, roles, ways of being were based, ways of knowing, ways of doing, they have become embedded and entrenched in the cultures and subcultures of higher education. And they're stuck. So if you take the well-known universities like Harvard and Oxford in the North, let's just take those. Let's not look at the ones on which we were based in the South. But the first women to be admitted to at Harvard was, interestingly, to the School of Education, which again is something we could have predicted. That was in 1920. 100 years ago only were the first women. And in the same year, 1920, at Oxford University in the UK, that's when the first women were allowed to graduate. So it's a short 100 years ago. And in terms of Black students being admitted, that had happened 50 years previous to women being admitted. And also then, of course, only male students. So the issues that arise from this particular lack of diversity has obviously had consequences in terms of learning and teaching approaches, curricula, research engagement, and of course, management and leadership. So the whole set of missions and purposes related to higher education, what was expected and set up in policies, often just by what Adele Moodley calls the morphogenesis, just by how it actually got started. So it disadvantages women, staff and students. And of course, the realities in which they live. In South Africa in particular, I think the struggles against colonialism and apartheid seem to have always superseded the struggles of women in these spaces. I mean, I remember being in our various sort of oppositional organizations, and they said the Black struggle comes first, you know, the struggle for national equality comes first. The struggle for women has to come after, or it's got to be subsumed within that. And of course, it never was, it never is. So women have raised their voices, but they've not had the power to change things significantly. And this is why women's voices and agency within leadership positions, where power to make these decisions exists, why that's so important. And I guess this is why I've always supported these initiatives. We have to develop the agency, but we also have to change the culture. And we also have to have the power to do that. So building this network and cohort of women who address these issues is really important.
As an historian and as an historian of women, I really appreciate the perspective that you just shared. Maria, you know, you come at this from the perspective of a scientist, right. And you know, did you have any, you know, lab experiences or, you know, early career mentors who helped you to understand maybe some of, I'm assuming like me, you know, you experienced some bias along the way to understand what was happening in your career trajectory.
Absolutely. I think personal experiences, and I was going to say some frustration associated with that, you know, led me to really focusing on this during the course of my career. And as you say, being a scientist, when I went into my first faculty position, major faculty position, I was the only woman in the department, and it was quite noticeable. And so I think that, you know, that dynamic that sets up is a little bit different. And I think from both the perspective of male faculty not knowing how to treat you, which I thought was very interesting. I'm like, I'm a person. You treat me like a person, you know, and so from that, you just, you know, and then you get encouragement and mentorship from others. And I was lucky to get mentorship from both men and women. So men as allies, I think, is very important. So some men actually, because they have the power, right, are able to then support you, you know, in that sort of sponsored career mobility aspects, which I think I used to call the good old boy network, but that for women, you know, to promote women the same way, to say this person is excellent and needs to be in these, you know, leadership positions. But overall, I, you know, with Title IX that happened in the US, which said if anybody is getting federal funding, there has to be equality and gender equality. People think about that mostly in sport, but it also in, you know, athletics, but it is also in other aspects. And that has led, I think, you know, for on the undergraduate level, most schools in the US have 60% or higher female enrollment now. So there's a gender gap the other way. But still, it doesn't translate into these positions of leadership. So seeing all of that, I want to give back, and I want to be able to mentor and support women all around the world to reach their full potential, because I think that's what we do as educators, right? And so it's frustrating that, you know, we're not able to assume those positions. It's getting better, but it's still not where it needs to be.
Yes, and so I know that the effort that ACE has long led, and I know this because I was involved in it, you know, initially had the sort of byline of moving the needle, and we were hoping to achieve, I know this may sound silly, especially given the impact of the pandemic, but we were really hoping to achieve gender parity by 2030. And now that it's 2022, you know, and with some of the statistics that you just shared and the similar statistics, you know, in South Africa, I just don't think that's going to be possible. But we're not giving up. And I'd like you both to spend some time, please, addressing the efforts that you are leading to try to make a difference for individual women and for higher education as a whole. So it doesn't matter to me which one of you starts, and please feel free to converse with each other as well.
Sure. Denise, you can go first.
Okay. Okay, thanks. So I found that really interesting what you just said, Maria, about, finding men as allies. And of course, in all struggles, there are always people who are those allies that we cannot do without, whatever the struggles may be. And so thank you for raising that, and for, again, making us aware of just how important both having allies is, but also how it is a dual responsibility.
Correct.
And I mentioned the work of Adele Moodley, because her most recent publication was one where she actually inquired from men leaders, how they see this whole issue and why it is taking so long for that needle to move, Carolyn, because it is moving very, very slowly. So I started out in this work in gender equity in higher education, in a program, again, it's that TALP project. It was the Tertiary Education Linkages Project. It was funded by USAID. And, the one I said Prof. Larry Robinson mentioned, because there was a partnering between them. And interestingly, I think, one of the universities who just was in the previous session. One of the most important milestones, there were 5. The 5th one, of course, not the first one. The 5th one was working towards gender equity in the institutions that were part of this project. They were all what we call the historically disadvantaged institutions, or the HDIs. So I was responsible for this particular milestone at the time, and we set up gender equity task teams. We collected a lot of data. We held workshops. We scrutinized and tried to change policies. The women themselves at these institutions did this work, so that, things could become, people could be more gender conscious. We spoke with the vice chancellors and hopefully become more gender fair. I think in those years, there were 3 to 4 out of the 23 VCs who were women. And so we had to rely on male allies in the form, but some were definitely not allies. So while TALP funded this work in those 17 institutions, it was really unfunded work within the university space. So no budget. This was in the early 2000s, no budget allocated to this work. And the women participating in this were doing this on top of their normal work, which is kind of how it happens, You do the work on top of your work, and you're definitely not rewarded for it. You're definitely not even accorded any recognition for it. And honestly, and often you fall actually into a particular category that in South Africa, the word we use is opstokers or agitators. It means agitators. And so, it simply becomes unsustainable. And I think that may be one of the reasons why the needle moves so slowly. And so we have to have those allies. But I think more important than the allies is the fact that we've got to start looking at the core. I have learned from this work, and I did work in HERS South Africa, which was based on HERS Mid-America. Those of you in the US would know that organization. And a similar organization was started in South Africa, also in the early 2000s. It runs a week-long academy where it brings together women. And again, serves this function of developing the camaraderie, the confidence, the sense of a network, a huge network of capable women, but still the systems do not change. So I do think that a primary focus of our work has got to be to look at how we shift the culture in organizations, and how we think about what's needed in higher education, and that a case be made for a different way of being. And it goes right back to my first answer. Where were the norms set in the first place? And those norms have just remained in place, but the context has changed dramatically. Your numbers in the US, Maria and Carolyn, are very similar to ours in South Africa. Just, the proportions of women that are there, the women who graduate with doctorates all the way through the system. And yet the norms in higher education, the policies don't change, take into account that there are more women in the system than men. And what does it mean in terms of how we think leadership should be, what we should provide, given that there are more women than men in the system? How do we take into account the life realities of women in terms of accomplishing the benchmarks, the goals, the achievements? To shift those is often designated as lowering standards, for example, yet we know from those women that the standards that are set by women, when you look at the cum laudes and you look at the number of people crossing what we call the stage during graduation, those numbers are huge. And the nature of the research work that they do is so significant. But still, there is this claim that it's going to lower standards if we shift some of those fundamental things. So I think besides the needle shifting, I think some of the benchmarks or the indicators on that gauge that we use for the needle, that those need to shift as well. And we can talk a little bit more about that.
That's perfect, Denise. I agree 100%. At our last conference in the spring, we talked about that. What are really the obstacles? And there's sort of individual types of things, and there's systemic things and policies also in there. So it's a combination. And when you speak with women, you know, there's personal issues, say they're married with children, and traditionally, culturally, right, women are the caregivers, and you know, will the family move because of the wife's job, right, versus the husband's job, and that, you know, as we just spoke personally about things, you know, leads to some strife, you know, in the marriage. And okay, you know, are they going to have to divorce their husband in order to move? You know, this kind of a thing, and they don't want to do that, right? They love their spouse, they love their family, and this was something that was a personal struggle for some people in that way. And just also the culture of leadership and what that looked like, that some women did not want to deal with that, right? And also, you know, wanted something that they felt was more rewarding, so that just the system overall didn't seem to be one conducive for them wanting to be in a more I wouldn't even say competitive, but in a way, some kind of cutthroat kind of you know, environments too were not appealing. But there's all these systemic policy changes, like you were mentioning as well. So is there leave for having children? Is there, you know, or they're caretakers for their parents? That was another thing that came up, and you know, that seemed to be disproportionate, that the women would be the caregivers in that situation as well, and that would limit their mobility. So there were a number of factors, I think there. The other thing we identified, which I think is important, is that women need to be on governing boards. And if more women were on governing boards, then they could address these more systemic issues, bring them up, make people aware of them, and also then change could happen. So that's one of the things we're talking about with the Women's Network through ACE. And then I just wanted to say that our setup I really enjoy, because we have networks in every state, plus Puerto Rico and the District of Columbia. And so they, you know, grassroots, they have institutional members, right, from around the state. Some states have more than one if they're very large states. And they can have programming and advocacy and support in each state. And then we come together, you know, actually we have the Women's Network Executive Council has monthly calls and then quarterly calls with the state chairs as an example. So I think that you didn't amplify the effect across the country. But so there's both a cultural piece and there's a systemic policy piece, I think.
So, you know, you've really both talked about change that needs to occur at two levels, right? At the individual level. And it seems that from what I know about the work in South Africa and from my involvement in the work in the US, we've done quite a bit in this regard, right? We've had programs, we have newer programs. We try to support women as individuals by bringing them together and offering them skill enhancement and providing networking and sponsorship and what have you. Then there's the change at the systemic level, which I think you've both addressed and you both suggested is harder to achieve. I want to go back to also a point that was made earlier. Maria, you were talking about the fact that sometimes when women do finally break through and they get to these leadership positions, they become what in the research is now called glass cliff situations. They are basically set up for failure. So certainly that does not help to advance the systemic changes that we need to see. So can you both talk a little bit more about the priorities and the goals, perhaps thinking about these two different levels? And are the programs that you're leading operating on both levels, or are they really focused on one or the other?
You want to go first this time, Adia?
I can go first. We've been thinking a lot about this, actually. So as I mentioned earlier, getting boards to shift and have more parity is one of the goals now that we're focusing on. So we were always looking at elevating to the presidency, but we're saying, well, being on governing boards is important. And also maybe it's just shifting to these other leadership roles that women want right now. So sort of an intermediate, I don't know if I call it an intermediate step, but that maybe focusing only on the highest level is not the goal of everyone. So it's just what does the highest level of leadership look like for you? So that's the individual. So now thinking that we will support and mentor women who want to be department chairs, deans, provosts, all the other levels in between, as well as the presidency, so that not everybody aspires to that top position. So that's I think a shift in thinking a little bit, as I mentioned, being on the boards. I think that also holding institutions more accountable. So that's that policy piece. So with our document that was ratified in 2014 of moving the needle initiative for ACE and WNEC and the Women's Network was, saying that you support it. So I think it was like, different universities just saying, affirmation, like we support this document, but there was no metrics, there was no accountability afterwards to say, well, how did you support this, but what are you actually doing? So we flirted with the idea, and it's just talk right now about, should there be a scorecard? Should we then say, okay, there's certain metrics then we're going to look for, and you're going to report back about how well you're doing. And that is really supporting the effort versus maybe just on, theoretically supporting the effort. So I think we're looking at all different levels. We started this year a women's leadership speaker series. I think that's been helpful, something similar, to what's going on here at a summit in a smaller scale. And then also our mentorship program, which has been wildly popular. We're just piloting it, but so many women would like to be mentored, to understand the ins and outs and how they can succeed. So we're looking at obviously the individual level, looking at the more institutional level, and then trying to put that all together, in a way that we can make some more progress.
I love that. I love the idea of the scorecard. I'm sure it would not be met with the warmest reception by many institutions.
Right.
But I mean, so boards, as we know, often have dashboards, right? Yes. Because trustees, regents, whatever their title is in different, parts of our country and the world, want to be able to track certain, performance measures. Can you imagine if we had one for gender and other kinds of equity issues? That would be amazing. Denise, what can you tell us about what's happening in South Africa on these two levels?
Yeah, I must say, perhaps personally, and not speak for the sector here, I have a healthy disrespect for scorecards and metrics, and mainly because I think they have been used in really superficial ways. I think if what underpins scorecards and metrics are substantive, then they may actually be measuring something, but if they simply are logging and ticking boxes, they actually mean nothing other than to show a picture that seems to be a beautiful dashboard, but the rest of the vehicle, if I relate a dashboard to a vehicle, the rest of it isn't working. So I guess that's my starting point for this answer, because I think that the priorities and goals have not changed that much, as the conditions for women have not really changed that much. However, the broader context has become so much more complex and certainly so much more fraught. Now, this word fraught, I just have to say for the South Africans in the audience, there's an Afrikaans word which sounds like fraught, but it's shorter. It's vrot. And it means rotten. Rotten. And I think in South Africa, and perhaps also in the world, in many organizational contexts, including in government, some things are quite clearly rotten. There's sort of that short fraught, not just the longer fraught, which is complex and challenging. And I think it's rotten in the core of how our institutions have been set up. So it's interesting what you say about getting more women onto boards. And I'm interested in how that changes things, because obviously how those boards work and the power that it has is the significant thing. But we need to think about how we need to start working to strengthen the core, which informs our work. We've got to excise what is rotten and no longer serves us and future generations, of students and graduates and staff. And what it is that is generative, that inspires and holds and supports us in where we are moving to, what we are moving towards in this complex world, which just requires different skill sets. So I hearkened back to the centuries before, when universities perhaps were started, and the contexts are so completely different. Those norms can't possibly still inform the core of what we do. So Michelle posted a question in the chat while you were talking. I had a look at that, and she asked about the extent to which COVID might have reversed things for women, gains made. And research done by some South African research team led by Dr. Walters and Professor Ronnie and others, and illustrated the extent to which the very things you mentioned, Maria, like women not only having to take care of children under the pandemic with homeschooling and so on, with schools being closed, but also to have to take care of elders more so, because all the over 60s were more at risk before the vaccine and so on. And so their work tripled. It didn't just double, it tripled. It was on both ends of what was already an environment which was really a very challenging one. But I'm saying that, the pandemic illustrated the extent to which we are unprepared for the future. And in that sense, it has been a really useful indicator. Unpreparedness is as useful an indicator as preparedness. And also, we don't really know how to describe the future we are going into. But conversely, I think it is also illustrated our capability to innovate, because there has been innovation. I mean, the emergence of a vaccine, within 1 year, where before it would take 12 years, that we can now be in a position where we can vaccinate and have people not wearing masks and not isolating. But we've also been able to rise to some challenges within the higher education environment. So I think that what we really need to be focusing on that other level, Carolyn, that you were talking about, besides what were the things that haven't changed in terms of policies and norms, is we have to be preparing our leaders, our staff, our students to re-examine current norms and practices and the policies and the philosophies that inform them. Because there's much we espouse in terms of transformation goals. Everybody's got wonderful transformation goals. What we do, how we are, what we expect of ourselves and others often do not match what we want to see coming into being. And that is critical thinking. Anyone who is critically challenging of things, from our students who we've had lots of experience challenging everything that we do, to exhibiting strong values and principles. And we see the corruption in our country, for example, including what we call university councils, the suspensions that are happening in universities. We think about humanizing pedagogies and the extent to which our students say that just does not exist. Our ways of being, the fact that we need creativity, you know, the famous Ken Robinson's creativity being at the core of innovation. We need collective, including diverse ways of thinking. And we also need collaborative, multi and interdisciplinary ways of designing solutions to the new challenges that confront us. Now, when I look at the people who are in our programs, in our Women in Leadership programs, I see that in abundance. So for me, there is absolutely no doubt that at that other layer, we need this kind of leadership that does the critical thinking, that's got agency, that wants things to be different, that does nurture. Yesterday in the session, our previous World Code participants, spoke about what they found useful in the Women in Leadership program that we run. They said it's because it was about creating a platform in which we create an environment where people can prosper, that can leverage our staff and those who come after us, that can leverage our students, a whole different way of thinking about wanting to be at the top of the rankings, global rankings, and other competitive things. It really went to the core of what I think we are looking for. So in essence, I think what we are trying to incorporate into a program that we run at the moment under the auspices of USAF and HELM, the Women in Leadership program, is we're trying to incorporate into the way we've designed that program from the topics and the focus areas, which is really about knowing that the sector and what's required of one in one's leadership, to our pedagogies, which are a lot more creative, a lot more interactive, a lot more collaborative. We're trying to incorporate this way of thinking into the curriculum in the World program. And I think that needs to be incorporated into our curricula at universities, from STEM subjects, where they say, no, we don't do touchy-feely stuff in science, as though one's senses aren't, absolutely at play when you're working in the sciences, all the way through to the humanities, which are supposed to focus on it, but also still adopts norms which don't often incorporate what is actually needed in terms of finding new solutions.
Well, thank you for, first of all, beginning to address the question that was put into the chat from one of our participants about the impact of COVID on where we are. And also I would say, Denise, for that hopeful message, because as we come to almost the end of the hour, it would be fabulous to think that we have some progress to report. And that the work that we're doing about the changes that really, and the innovation that really is needed in higher education as a whole, is being incorporated into our work to advance, women leaders so that they can lead that change. Maria, there's a lot to respond to.
there is a lot to respond to.
I'm going to pass it over to you and see what your thoughts are.
Yeah, and I want to thank Denise for eloquently, explaining the whole thing, and it just made me think that there has to be a willingness to change, right? And there has to be a passion for it and a drive, and if otherwise it is kind of superficial, right? I mean, we're not looking for just, hey, how do we work the system and check the box and onward we move, but the sort of the leadership and the desire of the institution, whatever that institution is, to really change, requires a lot of hard work. And I wonder too, with COVID, I was thinking about that people are tired, right? You know, I mean, it was scary. It was overwhelming. There was a lot to deal with, particularly in higher ed, as we were making, you know, decisions on the fly, right? In real time decisions about life and death, you know, as far as we knew. But the miraculous thing, I agree with you, you know, of how quickly we had the vaccines, how quickly we were able to adapt to the changing environments. I was very impressed with humanity. Like, you know what I mean? It was scary, yet I thought we could do this when there is the will to do it and, you know, get us to a certain place. The other thing I was thinking of is you know, the idea of collaboration on different levels, but also with groups that want to put this forward. So we mentioned HERS, ACE, HELM. I know there's others around the world. You know, maybe we need to have more of global summits, right? Because we are experiencing at the core, both, you know, what you described, Denise, and also similarities that we can rally around and share, you know, best practices and things that have worked or ideas around that. So that's kind of inspiring to me. That's why I wanted to participate today. So thank Carolyn for the invitation to meet Denise, and I'm sure others that are out there in the virtual world now hearing us. But how to connect everyone, because there's power in those numbers. And also, as you mentioned, Denise, creative ideas, right? Different ways of looking at it. And ways to attack this. So that gives me quite a lot of hope. I want to say that as far as, you know, getting on board's piece, AC is walking the talk, because chair of the WNEC, once we're done with our term, which is a 2-year term, we then roll on to the ACE board. So we thought that was extremely important, so that, you know, if we say that's important to be on boards, then ACE needs to have that kind of outlook as well, and the desire to change. But that's what really worries me. And I was thinking, you know, also, Denise, like we just recently in our institution put together a strategic plan. We talk about diversity, but I don't know how well we drill down into different topics. So I'll be looking at that.
Great.
Thank you. As we come to a close of this incredible conversation, I love the takeaway of, you know, thinking about how we can collaborate. I think that's what one of the purposes of the summit is, to bring people together within South Africa, but certainly across national boundaries and you know, between the global North and the global South, and figure out what can we learn from what's happening in South Africa from a U.S. point of view, you know, and the reverse. And I'm hoping, since CCAS and ACE are co-sponsors, that that we have people joining us from other parts of the world, as well, as both of those organizations are starting to become more global and want to become more global. But as the two of you, the two women who are before us today, sharing your experience and the history of efforts in your countries and your knowledge, I want to know, when you think about your leadership and you think about, you know, your concerns and your passion, and what's going to follow you. I mean, what do you both hope? This is our concluding question here. What do you hope is you know, some of the most important things that you will leave behind? You know, in other words, really, can you speak to what has mattered to you the most in terms of your contributions to this struggle? Denise, you said a little while ago, to being, you know, that kind of agitator. And why don't we start with you, Maria?
Wow, I think Denise and I talked about this a while ago about, you know, the legacy, and I don't think either one of us thinks like that. I think we want to do the best we can while we're in those positions, and I think to model that, to encourage and support others, and for me, it's, you know, to leave the women's network you know, better than it was before, right? And to tackling, because things evolve, right? So the tactics and the strategies maybe that were beneficial before, you know, may not be the best ones now, and you know, or the best ones for the future. So I think the idea of you know, being flexible, creative, collaborative, and looking to build that network, strong network, whether it's nationally or globally, is what I hope to do. What are the, I'm more of a connector, facilitator type of person. So if that is advanced, that would be wonderful.
Great.
Yeah. So great. I'm so glad, Maria, that you are going to be the connector that gets us all together talking about these things. And Carolyn, of course, as well. That's part of the role she plays. But as you said, I always find this so tricky, because when one is actively involved in something, we are in the moment, we're so fully present that thoughts of what you will leave behind are not in the forefront of your awareness necessarily. But it should be, I guess. And of course, also what one intends to happen or leave behind has a very strange and human way of turning out completely differently. So this is the other reason why I'm always afraid to speak to this particular question. But I guess that I can speak to the intention. And that is I go back to what I just said in response to the previous question, that it really is, and I'm borrowing here from Zani, who spoke yesterday, that it is really to provide a platform. And she took this from what the Vice Chancellor at Nelson Mandela University, Professor Sibongile Mutwa, said. How do you provide an environment and a platform in which those with whom we play host, to those who enter with anticipation and then hopefully exit the space we have created, richer, more informed, better prepared, more confident, but still open to learning more, open to facing the challenges that inevitably await as the world continues to change. I think if I had an aspiration for what I'd like to leave behind, and an intention is to create that kind of space, we, as Prof. Mutwa said, leadership is about hosting. And Peter Block, another sort of community builder, facilitator, has said leadership is convening. And so I go in with the intention of how do we convene and set up a space where we do what we do really well as women, which is host things. I love that because it's a very feminine image, actually. But men also are excellent hosts, can be excellent hosts, if they don't only focus on the wine, but also on the food. We can perhaps have a more holistic way of thinking about what is needed to feed this next generation, so that they go out, they exit, really open to being different, doing things differently, open to learning, being more confident, open to facing the challenges, and not necessarily thinking that they have all the answers. I think that's what we want. And that's what I think I'm going to work for.
That's
so thank you, Carolyn.
Yeah, I mean, that's what we are trying to accomplish today. And I think we have accomplished, and we're not done yet. And I hear both of you as women leaders saying that leadership to you in this space about trying to move the needle or create, a different type of, higher education that serves all is really about the two words I've heard are convening and connecting. And so I wonder if, it's one of these, one of the pluses of these virtual formats is that we can have women and all people join us from everywhere and listen in, but we can't see them. And I'm wondering in the time that we have left, would you each be willing to try to speak to the women who are our participants today, who we cannot see, but we know are out there, who are thinking, who are listening to you and thinking, wow, Maria and Denise are such fabulous women, and they're at earlier stages of their career, and they're wondering, do they have what it takes to move forward in their career and to be successful and to be a leader and to manage the impacts of the pandemic and their family circumstances and what have you? What message do you have for them? Would you speak to them?
Well, I think they're great. It's great that they're here. And I'm very optimistic about the future as I interact with the folks around the world. And I think just be courageous, be your authentic self, bring your authentic self to the table and be courageous. And you are courageous already, and you have that in you. So I think that sharing those ideas that you have and going forward, the world is changing for the better. And I think always when it does, there is this turmoil and struggle, right? For those who want it the way it used to be, as opposed to what it will be. So I think that's my advice. And I appreciate them listening and being involved, because that's what it's all about, right? Is if it's said, if they don't have a chair at the table, you bring your own chair and you make it work. You make it work.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, thank you for that, Maria. I mean, the courage is really the most important thing, and the thing about courage that I know from the etymology of the word, and of course from wonderful people like Maya Angelou, is that courage at its very core, going back to core, is heart, that comes from the French word. I don't know how to say it in French, but the first 3 letters come from the meaning for heart. And I think that is something I would want to say to women leaders, something that one of our women leaders who spoke yesterday, part of the second cohort, said, you've got to know that you're leading from within. Mm-hmm. And you've got to know yourself, and you've got to know that you've got to keep yourself filled up, because you can't pour from an empty cup. And so keeping your heart full, and people like Paulo Freire say the same thing, education is all about heart, and it's all about love. That it's about the love for humanity, it's about the love for our generations who come after us, it's for the love of our planet that sustains us, it's for all of those things that there is really an imperative to do things differently. Because the way things have been done for centuries within this space has certainly created some advances. Certainly, Birgit, my co-facilitator in the Women in Leadership program, has this lovely little video, but I cannot now remember the name of the person, but who shows the statistics in a visual way of how much things have changed. Things have changed. We can be hopeful. But I think we also need to be doing things differently, and to be able to change with those changes. So it's in us. I think that's the courage is in us, our hearts are in us, and I think we've got the capability to do it. So thank you very much for this opportunity, and we hope to see more women taking this platform.
Yes, we do. And as I close us out, I want to say that a couple of days ago, I led a session of presidents, vice chancellors, rectors, depending on where you are in the world, your title, who are speaking about the future of higher education. And one of the panelists who joined us talked about the fact that she is the first woman rector of her Islamic university in Jakarta. And it's so amazing, given what you just said, Denise. She talked about how she sees that role, and takes it very seriously, and that she knows as a woman that she needs to lead with heart. So I encourage, and I thank you both so much for your time today, for your insights, for sharing your passion and your knowledge. And I think that what I hear from both of you is a hopeful message. What I heard from her it was a hopeful message. And I think we do have to take heart. I think that we have to recognize and cultivate courage and flexibility and resilience in ourselves and in the other women who we work with, and encourage us to not just become leaders as individuals, but become leaders who will help to change the system and to change that history that we all have inherited. So let's hold hands across our nations and across geographic and national boundaries, and let's figure out how we can learn from each other and work together going forward. Because I do think we have a lot of work still to do to create the kind of world that we want, the kind of higher education systems that we want. And I know that the two of you are doing fabulous work. The women in our audience, I know, are doing so as well. And let's figure out how we can connect and collaborate and convene more of these kinds of opportunities. So thanks very much to both of you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank
Bye.
you. So lovely talking with all of you.
Yes, it was a pleasure. Thank you so much.
Wonderful. Bye-bye. Thanks, Carolyn. Thanks, Maria.
Thanks,
Michelle.
Bye, everybody.